Film, video, and now digitally based images can bear witness to what took place in front of the camera with extraordinary fidelity. This fidelity serves the needs of fiction filmmaking as much as it facilitates the work of medical imaging through the use of X-rays, MRIs, or CT scans. The fidelity of the image may be as crucial to a close-up of Leonardo DiCaprio or Cate Blanchett as it is to an X-ray of a lung, but the uses of that fidelity are vastly different. We may know that both offer evidence about the world around us, but we treat the former as evidence highly filtered through the eyes of the filmmaker, and the latter as an almost direct, untampered transcription of specific properties found in the world. We believe what we see at our own risk.
It is a universally known urban legend that when watching the first ever public showing of a movie, the arrival of a train at La Ciotat station, audiences leapt from their seats in horror of a locomotive about to end them. There's not much validity to this, of course, a couple scared moviegoers, and yet this has been used over the years as a symbol of archaism, the naive foolishness of an average viewer, especially one of the past. But is it not rational to trust that what you see before your own eyes is real? Even within the film's diegeses, when you see a train coming toward the person, you expect them to get run over. There's been a recent cultural resurgence of an idea of unreliable narrators, the fascination with not being able to trust what you see with your own two eyes. It has been used very widely. Any story that obfuscates the truth has been given a label of an unreliable narrator, but that does not contend with the definition given to it by Wayne C. Booth.
I have called a narrator reliable when he speaks for or acts in accordance with the norms of the work, which is to say, the implied author's norms. Unreliable when he does not.
There are many reasons why a character might not have full access to the truth, from insanity to purposeful deceitfulness. So how do we, as an audience, handle when a movie lies to us?
Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo is at its core a detective story, told from one singular perspective. A story of an investigator hired to help a woman suffering from delusions of a past life, haunting her until her unfortunate demise. Barring one scene, we are rarely afforded to look into other characters' minds. We only see them through the eyes of John Scotty Ferguson. This is not just a question of framing. A lot of the movie revolves around characters altering themselves to fit into Scotty's gaze.
I'd stay and lie, hoping that I could make you love me again, as I am for myself. And so forget the other and forget the past.
But, in the third act of the movie, there is a shift. We get the aforementioned scene, where for one moment, we are privy to something our main character doesn't know. The narration shifts to let us in on the secret that he, and subsequently we, as the viewer, have been misled about the identity of the woman he's been following. In this moment, the narration steps away from the perspective we held before. We, the viewers, still see everything through the eyes of our main character, with the framing emphasizing realizations we were already informed of. Going forward, we don't only experience the recontextualized nature of prior events, but as we are privy to the plot twist before our main character, the experience becomes almost a voyeuristic spectacle, seeing a man spiral to obsession, with the key to this mystery right before his eyes. The detective genre is of course not new to third act bombshell revelations, but rarely do they come from the invisible hand of the narrator to separate us from our point of view character. Through this framing, we can see how our main point of view character can differ from our narrator, an often absent figure that presents us with required information to frame a movie and its themes in a particular way. Now having this understanding and terminology firmly separated in our minds, we can move on to the next subject of our analysis.
In a lot of ways, it is easy to draw a parallel between Vertigo and Mulholland Drive. David Lynch presents us with a detective story, an amnesiac woman trying to figure out who she is, while a background plot of a corrupt Hollywood production provides us with hints. This straightforward perception is altered in the second act through a violent revelation of identity-consuming obsession, ending with the destruction of the object of said obsession. Through the simple comparison, it is easy to assume similarity in the analysis of narration and framing. But Mulholland Drive shows us an ever-present, distinct narrative voice that does not reveal itself until the end of the movie. The story is split into two parts, the dream and the reality of our narrator Camilla, that exist in an almost circular fashion. Due to this story's hallucinatory nature, it often conveys its themes through repetition. Names, objects, characters will appear in seemingly unrelated scenes to deepen our understanding of Camilla as a narrator. Both in reality and in Daydream, we are presented with her dependent obsessions, fame-seeking behavior, both stemming from a desperate desire to be seen. However, while she is the de facto narrator, most often we will experience scenes through specific characters, the aforementioned representations of her psyche. Here we are presented with the question of whose perspective are we supposed to follow in the story? Are we meant to get attached to characters that end up being nothing more than figments of a vengeful and jealous imagination? It's a silly question taken to a serious degree, as very often the mere idea of an "it was all a dream" plot is seen as a poor cliché but also a deep betrayal. Stories that hinge themselves on narrators' perceived insanity often run the risk of being called pointless. That if the characters and the relationships ultimately did not exist within the reality of the story, they are rendered useless.
In vain. It was all in vain. The hero was but a puppet, striving to help the imaginary population of a town that was nothing more than a drawing.
That is, of course, an emotional way of reading film, but it is ultimately very revealing of the way we view film, the cultural language we have curated for it. A film's diegesis is held up in such high regard that to break it requires an inherent untrustworthiness on the behalf of the creators, a distaste for the viewer. To maintain a viewer content, a story must follow an internal logic that is at least similar to our real life. An unreliable narrator acts not only as an intrusion to the diegetic reality of the movie, but also as a stark reminder that what you're watching is not real. At its core, an unreliable narrator is anathema to an immersive story. It is at its nature surrealist and dependent on you as the audience to make judgment on what parts of the story you choose to believe. We as an audience are often averse to reminders that the characters we view on screen are fake. That is why breaking the fourth wall is most often met in horror or comedy. There is a shock in being reminded that what you're watching is not just being curated through the eyes of a character or an ever-present narrator, but with your gaze in mind.
What the spectator must see is what the director makes her see.
Rashomon is a narrative where you never truly find out what happened. It would be a disservice to call it a detective story, although a large chunk of it does take place in a literal courtroom. Reading the way different people retold the plot of the original story made me draw an instinctual connection to the movie Wavelength, in that talking about and summarizing Rashomon is an exercise in basic art analysis that will inevitably reveal the perspective with which you approach film. In the simplest way I can put it, Rashomon is a story of a woman debauched and a samurai murdered, told from the three participants: the wife, the husband, and the bandit. Getting to hear from these characters, they all act as both the narrators and the point of view characters for their specific section, although the overarching plot and the framing of the shots outside of the narration of the individual stories is a largely neutral third party that has its own perspective on the events. This is a deviation from traditional ideas of unreliable narration, as we are not presented with the objectively correct alternative or explanation for why a story is being told in a biased way. Here the bias of any given character is presented as inherent to their perception of the world, in the same way I perceive a situation different from you. Every event and person is altered through the distorting lens of a different person's perspective. This is of course not including that any given person could be lying. That is not a metric we can evaluate rationally, so we have to ask the same question in slightly different ways. Which one of these characters is most likely to lie? And who does the story position as most likely to lie? That last question is especially relevant as the story has been interpreted through the distorting lens of the original short stories, In a Grove and Rashomon by Ryunosuke Akutagawa, but also through the lens of Akira Kurosawa himself while creating the film. Including the character perspectives, the film thus offers us a wide range of ways to read it. In his essay analyzing the many interpretations of Rashomon, George Linden breaks it down not to the narrative perspectives of the characters themselves, instead presenting 5 distinct ways of breaking down the story: as a commercial venture, as a work of art, as cultural allegory, as a film, and as a philosophic statement. Thus we are presented with the final point of conflict in the presentation of any given narrative: the authors. The perception of the story is often colored by the context it was created in, both for the actual authors and for the audience trying to interpret it. The voice of the author is ever present, and I do not mean this in a singular auteur way. The visual language of the movie, the non-diegetic storytelling elements in the form of music and editing and advertising presentation of the film all affect our reading of it.
One look at the stills used to advertise the film reveals the attitudes of the producer and his staff. The stills are of 2 types: gross exaggeration or sex shots. Since Rashomon is neither a comedy nor an exploitational sex film, Daiei obviously did not understand what Kurosawa had created. The advertising was eminently misleading, if not downright false.
The ideology of a narrator will always be in conversation with the framing a movie chooses. As heroic as a narrator can present himself, a bandit is still dressed as a bandit, and a samurai as a samurai.
So what is the purpose of an unreliable or a biased narrator in a movie? As the medium that requires the least active participation and engagement from the viewer, a lot of works of film encourage the passive interpretation of the narrator to point of view character relationship. We are meant to engage with them as one and the same, and on some level, a direct reflection of the views and opinions of the filmmakers, whether consciously or subconsciously. Through the framing of an unreliable narrator, or even a biased one, we create a conscious separation of the ideological blocks the narrative is built upon. By asking the viewer to question the validity of what they're being told, we create clarity of purpose through obfuscation.